Okay, we're in Module 4 on IT funding decisions. So wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about IT spending, just some basic concepts. And so, as you can imagine, technology is very expensive, it's high impact. So decisions about how much to spend where, when, and where to invest in IT are critical. Poor decisions may lead to major negative consequences. So I think a key skill for you all is the ability to evaluate investment opportunities for IT and to make IT investments that will have positive business impact. The cost of failing to do that can be very high. So here are some questions we're going to address here. So first off, how much should companies spend? Does spending guarantee results? How should spending be divided between applications and infrastructure? What are some different types or categories of IT investments? And then finally, how is IT typically funded within organizations? So let's start with number one, the first question: how much should companies spend on IT? And the great answer in our field is it always depends. So it really depends on the nature of the industry, its competitive landscape. It also depends on the companies. Do they tend to be more offensive, aggressive, or defensive with respect to technology? Do they have an IT architecture that's become complex and costly and fragmented over time? That could impact. They may need to spend more to maintain that versus, let's say, being on a more modern cloud-based architecture. The typical metric companies use to measure IT spending is percentage of revenue, and you can see here just within retail that varies, average versus maximums, and you get into software publishing, internet services. I'd say financial services. These types of industries spend a greater percentage on IT as a percent of revenue than, let's say, retail and wholesale businesses. So it does vary by industry, but there are a lot of other factors to consider. So, but again, the typical metric that organizations look at is spending as a percent of revenue. So you could probably get some benchmarks for your industry, but keep in mind that company differences individual differences among companies may influence IT spending. So in our book, Adventures of an IT Leader, the reading The Cost of IT, Barton, who's our CIO, that's their annual costs are about 8% of sales annually. So it's running kind of high above this historical norm. And so from reading the article, I think you could attribute some of their costs to a complex and fragmented IT infrastructure because they have a decentralized funding model that we'll talk about here in a little bit. So essentially, decentralized governance, business units making their own decisions. So their IT costs were going up as a result of that. So they were a little out of whack with respect to their IT costs. So second question, does IT spending guarantee results? Does it guarantee payoff? And so the answer is no. It really depends on how you use IT. There were some early studies that found a low correlation between IT spending and productivity across multiple industries. This was, I think, in the late 90s. But what was interesting is this study was done at a time where spending on technology was exploding, going through the ceiling, and yet, so while there's huge amounts of money being spent on technology, they found a low correlation between spending and productivity. So there was a disconnect here, and that was coined the IT productivity paradox. But later studies did find high correlation between IT spending and payoff in terms of productivity for specific industries. And these were industries that were highly competitive that required management innovation to keep ahead. And so these managers were innovating with technology to keep ahead. So what they found is that the correlation wasn't uniform, the low correlation. And so there were some industries, there was little correlation between IT spending and productivity, and others they found more correlation. And further, they found that IT did pay off when companies targeted IT at productivity levers that mattered most for their particular industry. So, essentially, aligning spending IT to help drive their strategy on things that are really important for that business. Plus, where investments were coupled with managerial innovation. So this is where they found IT investments paying off. So the bottom line is that spending money on technology doesn't automatically produce results. It really depends upon making smart decisions in its deployment. And that really gets back to our information systems strategy triangle from Module 3, the alignment of those strategies. And further, just as a corollary to all this, I think that the authors I've read would argue that companies that just adopt general purpose technologies without thinking through its impacts, let's say the technology is getting a lot of press and hype, and you say, hey, we need this, and you really haven't thought through, how are you going to apply it specifically in your business context, that if you do buy that and deploy it, it's unlikely to have that you're going to see big payoff from that. All right, third question. How do we mix our spending? What's the right level of mix between applications and infrastructure? And you've seen this diagram before. So how should you split your percentages? And again, I'd say that the answer is it really depends. So you need infrastructure to keep the lights on, to keep the lights running, to enable new business apps. We've talked about that. You need apps to help the business compete. Your workers need the right applications. So in our Adventures of an IT Leader, they initially spent up to 90% on apps versus 10% on infrastructure when the company started, the startup, but it grew to this percentage breakdown over time, which was really a natural progression because as a company adds more applications, you need more infrastructure to support that. Now, in the case of IVK, in this reading, the Adventures of an IT Leader, I think much of their costs, they contributed unnecessarily to rising costs through making poor decisions, allowing business units to make their own decisions about IT. So I think that helped to increase their cost. So what are some management best practices on this subject of spending on applications versus infrastructure? Excuse me. Really, I think number one, spend as little as possible on maintaining infrastructure and as much as possible on value-added apps. I'm not saying you want to let your infrastructure become outdated or run down, but value-added apps that's what's going to help your firm compete. So find ways to maintain or reduce your IT infrastructure costs, such as cloud design, cloud infrastructure. You want an infrastructure that serves as a platform to launch new apps, and one that's simple, that's robust, and that can quickly adapt to changing business needs. Okay, the fourth question, what are some categories of IT investments? Really three areas I want to look at: revenue enhancing versus cost reducing types of projects. VW uses a model where they have three types of IT investments, and then third, we're going to look at IT value pathways, which is from one of the chapters that we read. So essentially, what are some different types of projects or areas that companies invest in on technology? So one way to categorize IT investments would be through describing them as revenue enhancing or cost reducing projects. Okay, so revenue enhancing projects would be IT projects that, if they're successful, will help improve organizational revenue. Cost reducing would be projects that help the company to reduce costs, so labor saving costs. If you compare these types of IT projects, revenue-enhancing projects tend to have more upside potential. In terms of immediacy of impact, I would say the cost-reducing projects tend to have a more immediate impact. These revenue-enhancing projects tend to be more speculative, and I think the benefits received from these projects take longer typically to realize. I think the ability to quantify would be easier for cost-reducing projects. And finally, in an economic downturn, I think that cost-reducing projects are probably going to be easier to sell to senior management, easier to get funded. VW uses a method of classification of IT projects. They basically classify projects into three buckets, if you will. Some projects are mandatory. They need to be undertaken regardless of the financial return on investment, oftentimes due to external forces, regulatory compliance. You have option creating projects which are speculative and risky in nature with future and maybe unanticipated benefits. So maybe big data projects. They're just saying, hey, we need to get in the game here and we want to test this out. We want to pilot some things, but we can't. We're not sure what the benefits are, but we think we need to be involved in this. And there may not be a reasonable ROI on those. And then third, they classify what they call kind of your traditional NPV projects, IT projects that demonstrate a clear return on investment. So from the standpoint of VW, they view themselves as needing a portfolio. They typically at any given point in time will have a portfolio of different types of IT projects. In the one reading we had, the one chapter from Guiding the Digital Transformation of Organizations, Sombermurthy and Smud identify 6 different classifications, what they call IT value pathways, types of investments, similar to Volkswagen. So companies can have mandated projects. So, for example, required electronic health record implementations for healthcare. Technology renewal would be infrastructure renewal. Projects for business process improvement. Competitive necessity, those are projects that if you don't undertake would put you at a competitive disadvantage. So online banking in the late 90s, it got to a point where if you didn't have that, you'd be at a competitive disadvantage. Some projects are undertaken for purposes of competitive advantage, and then what they refer to as options generator projects. So these would be more, this would be akin to VW's option creating investments, where these are more speculative and risky in nature. So the fact is that when we look at this, companies invest money in IT projects for a number of different reasons. And so, since there are different categories of IT investments, what are the implications of this for deciding what projects to fund? And so, we'll talk more about this later on in the lockstep and some of the other readings. But I think one of the big implications here is you can't necessarily use the same yardstick or means of comparison across all projects. Companies, if your yardstick for approving IT investments is simply return on investment, there are going to be projects you don't fund that maybe need to be funded, that are maybe just mandatory, or infrastructure renewal that you may not be able to put an ROI on that. Or there may be certain more speculative types of option creating projects that you need to be getting into and testing for future opportunities, that if you just simply look at ROI, you don't invest in those projects. So I think that the big takeaway here is that companies need to consider the different kind of buckets, if you will, or categories of IT investment, and to consider their whole portfolio and have a portfolio approach to IT investments. And really the last thing to consider here, the last question is, how does IT get funded within organizations? I didn't want to spend a lot of time on this, but in our reading, IVK and the CIO, in their situation, they followed a service provider model, which meant they had no budget. The business units had all the budget money, they had budget control, and so IT would basically provide services and charge back to cover their costs. And so that's the service provider model. And if you read through the pros and cons of this, the big disadvantage is that IT has much less clout. So business units have the money, they have the budget, they're calling the shots. They can even engage in outside services, and so it becomes much more difficult to manage and to maintain your IT operations and infrastructure. And so, it's really akin to decentralized IT governance. So in the reading, Barton wanted to move to a cost center model where the IT organization would own 100% of the budget. So that'll be akin to the centralized model, and there are pros and cons to that. And so I think in the end here, what's advocated is co-ownership or a shared budget model where IT owns a portion of the budget where they can do projects that they need to do, let's say infrastructure, and they don't have to ask the business units for funding, and where business units own their own portion of the budget for their own specific needs. So I just wanted to point that out in terms of the IT is a service center, so that's where business units own the budget. IT is a cost center where IT owns all the budget, and then this shared business model. Thank you.